Hey guys, today we will be talking about chapter 9, which is going to cover the nervous system. So the nervous system is broken up into two different areas. We have the central nervous system and then the peripheral nervous system. Within the central nervous system are the brain and the spinal cord. So if you kind of think of that central location down kind of the center of the body, the brain and the spinal cord are located. Then we have the peripheral nervous system, which is going to include all of the nerves, and then the autonomic nervous system, which is responsible for regulating involuntary functions. So this includes heart rate, breathing, and digestion. Here's kind of a flow chart of kind of the divisions of the nervous system. So you can see the central nervous system. Oh, I lost my mouse. There we go. The central nervous system is at the top here with the brain and the spinal cord. So all of the information or the nerves are going to branch off of the central nervous system to form the peripheral nervous system. So from the brain, we have the cranial nerves, and from the spine, we have the spinal nerves. Those then communicate with each other, eventually sending those messages back up to the central nervous system. The main cell of the nervous system is going to be the neuron, which we kind of touched base on in chapter 4. So if you remember that back to that, the structure of each neuron is going to contain a cell body, a dendrite, and an axon. So the dendrite is going to conduct those impulses to the cell body while the axon carries the impulses away. You'll notice when you look at this picture that the axon kind of has these little coverings around it. Those are referred to as myelin. So this is formed by a Schwann cell, which you'll see right here. This is going to wrap around axons outside of the central nervous system. So the Schwann cell is found in the peripheral nervous system. And then the nodes of Ranvier are the gaps between the adjacent Schwann cells. So you can kind of see this little gap in there, and that's the nodes. So the myelin sheath, again, is just going to cover the axon of the neuron, so the portion of the neuron that carries the impulses away. The Schwann cell is only found in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so if we're talking about the brain or the spinal cord, which is in the central nervous system, there are no Schwann cells there. The neurolema is the actual sheath of that Schwann cell. So you can see the nucleus is here, and then there's a covering of the cell that wraps all the way around, and that's the neurolema. This is important because it plays a role in the regeneration of cuts and injured axons. So since there's no Schwann cells in the central nervous system where the brain and the spinal cord are, the chances of regeneration, if there is injury to the axons in those areas, is far less than those of the peripheral nervous system. So we can separate these neurons into different groups according to their function. So sensory or afferent neurons are going to conduct impulses to the spinal cord and brain. Motor or efferent are going to conduct impulses away. So the motor neurons are going towards the muscles and the glands. And then interneurons are going to conduct impulses from sensory neurons to motor neurons. These are also referred to as central or connecting neurons. So they're kind of the middleman between the sensory and the motor neurons. We do have some support cells that are referred to as glia or neuroglia cells. So the central glia are found in the central nervous system, so the brain and the spinal cord. And those are broken up into 3 different types. So the astrocytes are star-shaped cells that anchor small blood vessels to the neurons. So those play a role in forming the blood-brain barrier, which is important for keeping chemicals, waste products, stuff like that out of the brain. Microglia are small cells that move in inflamed brain tissue. They are responsible for phagocytosis. And then the oligodendrocytes form the myelin sheaths on the axons in the central nervous system. So that's important to note, is that there are myelin sheaths on the axons in the central nervous system, but the oligodendrocytes are responsible for those instead of the Schwann cells. So in the peripheral nervous system, really the only supporting cell that we have is the Schwann cell, and that's responsible for forming the myelin sheath of the axons in the peripheral nervous system. So here's just kind of a visualization of those different types of glia cells. So astrocytes here, you can see they're kind of star-shaped. The microglia, again, are responsible for that phagocytosis, and then the oligodendrocytes are here forming those myelin sheaths. So what you'll notice here is that one oligodendrocyte actually goes to multiple myelin sheaths. So this also helps, or has another function, where the oligodendrocytes hold the nerve cells together. So the difference between nerves and tracts: a nerve is going to be a bundle of peripheral axons, where a tract is a bundle of central axons. White matter is tissue composed primarily of myelinated axons. Could be either nerves or tracts, regardless of where it is in the body. And then the gray matter is going to be composed primarily of cell bodies and unmyelinated fibers. So that would be the cell body of the neuron and then the dendrites. There are fibrous connective tissue that's going to cover each section of the nerve. So when we look at this next slide, you'll see that the composition of a nerve is pretty similar to the composition of a muscle tissue. Of course, it's different tissue types, but they still kind of build on one another. So we have the endoneuron, which surrounds an individual fiber within a nerve, the perineuron, which is going to surround a fascicule of nerve fibers, then the epineuron, which surrounds the entire nerve. So you can see here how the nerve is kind of built upon each other. So you have your individual fiber. We're going to have the endoneuron around that. So here's your individual fiber surrounded by the endoneuron. Groups of those fibers are going to form fascicules, which are surrounded by the perineuron, and then groups of fascicles are going to create the nerve as a whole, which is surrounded by the epineuron. The nerve signals are going to have a couple of different pathways that they can take, and these are known as reflex arcs. So the neuron pathway is going to go from receptors to effectors, resulting in a reflux. So the receptor is going to be the beginning of dendrites of sensory neurons. Remember, those dendrites are taking the impulse to the nerve body. And then the effectors are going to be an organ that puts nerve signals into effect. So this is commonly muscles or glands. The reflex is going to vary depending upon the organ that's put into effect by the impulse. So if it's a muscle, the reflex is going to be contraction. If it's a gland, it would be secretion. These reflex arcs are broken up into two different types, a 2-neuron arc and a 3-neuron arc. The biggest difference is that the 2-neuron arc is only going to have sensory neurons and motor neurons. There's no interneurons in between. The 3-neuron arc is going to involve a sensory neuron, an interneuron, and then a motor neuron. So when it says that the sensory neuron is going to synapse with the interneurons, that just refers to the junction between the nerve cells. So that's saying that the sensory neuron is going to meet up with the interneuron, which is then going to meet up with the motor neuron. So you can see here that this is going to be a 3-neuron reflex. So we start with our receptor here, which is the stretch receptor. The impulse is going to travel up that, go across the interneuron here, and then to the motor neuron, and then travel down to the muscle, which is the effector. So a nerve impulse is a self-propagating wave of electrical disturbance that travels along the surface of a neuron membrane, also referred to as an action potential. So this is basically saying that it's a self-propelling current of electricity that travels along the surface. So if you think of kind of like a power line, how the power is going to go from the transformer up the line and then to the power in your house, that's kind of what's happening with these nerve impulses. So for this nerve impulse to take place, we have to start by thinking about the neuron at rest. So there's no impulse traveling through. When it's at rest, it has a slightly positive polarization on the outside. So there's more sodium ions on the outside of the neuron. A stimulus is going to trigger the opening of those sodium channels. And then the inward movement of the sodium ions depolarizes the membrane. So now the inside is more positive than the outside. And that depolarization is what is referred to as a nerve impulse or the action potential. So the stimulated section of the membrane immediately repolarizes, but at that point the depolarization has gone to the next section of the membrane. So remember, this is a wave that's going. If you think of a wave, people doing the wave at like a sporting event. So as one person is putting their hands up, the person before them has already put their hands down. And when you're putting your hand down, the person beside you is putting their hands up. So it's kind of this just ongoing wave that occurs. So the synapse is going to be the place where the impulse are transmitted from one neuron to another. The neuron before the synapse is called the presynaptic neuron, and the one after is the postsynaptic. So every synapse is going to have 3 different structures: the synaptic knob, the synaptic cleft, and then the plasma membrane. So the synaptic knob is going to be the bulge at the end of the presynaptic neuron that's going to contain small sacs that hold the neurotransmitters. The synaptic cleft is the space between the synaptic knob and the plasma membrane. And then the plasma membrane is referring to that of the postsynaptic neuron. And this contains proteins that bind to neurotransmitters and initiate that impulse. So neurotransmitters bind to specific receptor molecules in the membrane of the postsynaptic neuron, which is going to result in ion channels opening and then that impulse conduction, where that wave-like movement of the impulse throughout the membrane. So here is just a visualization of the components of the synapse. So the presynaptic neuron is going to be here, and this is the synaptic knob. Synaptic cleft is the area between the two, and then here's the plasma membrane of the postsynaptic neuron. So these are the sacs that contain those neurotransmitters. They become released and then cause that impulse to occur. Some neurotransmitters that you might hear about: acetylcholine, norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin, endorphins, enkephalins, nitric oxide. Regardless of the neurotransmitter, all of them, after that impulse conduction is initiated by that postsynaptic neuron, the neurotransmitter is going to be rapidly terminated. So it's a very quick process regardless of what type of neurotransmitter. So now we'll get into the actual kind of structure of the nervous system. So we'll start with the central nervous system, which again is the brain and the spinal cord. And we'll look at the brain first. So the first division that we'll talk about is the brain stem, which is made up of 3 parts: the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. So these components primarily are made up of white matter with a little bit of gray matter scattered throughout. So remember that the white matter is white because it's made up of those myelinated axons. All 3 parts of the brainstem will conduct impulses to the higher part of the brain. Specifically, the medulla kind of has an important role here. So it is responsible for the cardiac, respiratory, and vasomotor centers. So collectively, this is known as the vital centers. So this just kind of shows you where they are. So here's the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla down below. So those 3 components make up the brain stem. Then we'll look at the cerebellum. So this is a gray matter outer layer that is thin but highly folded. The arbor vitae is an internal tree-like network of white matter tracts. Main function is going to be control muscle contractions, and then coordinating effects, such as assisting the cerebrum and other regions of the brain. So the cerebellum lies under the occipital lobe of the cerebrum. So this is the second largest part of the brain. So kind of underneath the occipital bone, you'll find the cerebellum. So next we have the diencephalon, which is a small but very important part of the nervous system. The 3 components of this are the hypothalamus, thalamus, and the pineal gland. So the hypothalamus consists mainly of the posterior pituitary gland, pituitary stalk, and gray matter. This is the major center for controlling the autonomic nervous system. So if we think back, the autonomic nervous system is responsible for those involuntary functions, so heart rate, breathing, and digestion. It is also responsible for controlling the hormone secretion by the anterior and posterior pituitary glands. The thalamus is a dumbbell-shaped mass of gray matter. It is going to produce sensations and associate those sensations with emotion. It also plays a part in the arousal mechanism. So if if you're close with your grandma and she always makes you spaghetti every Wednesday, eventually you will start to associate spaghetti or the act of eating spaghetti with the feelings that you have for your grandma, essentially. And the thalamus is what's responsible for that. The pineal gland is a small body resembling a pine nut, and it sits behind the thalamus. It adjusts the output of the time-keeping hormone, melatonin, in response to changing levels of external light. So it receives sensory information about the strength of the light and then adjusts the output of melatonin. And melatonin is helpful in making us sleepy. So if you have trouble sleeping, melatonin is a great herbal supplement, I've heard, to help you fall asleep. The cerebrum is the largest and uppermost part of the brain. This is kind of the area that people think about when they think about the brain. The cerebral cortex is going to be the thin outer layer of gray matter made up of dendrites and cell bodies. And then the interior is going to be composed mainly of white matter, so again, those myelinated sheaths of the axons. Functions of the cerebrum include mental processes of all types, sensations, consciousness, memory, and voluntary control. So here you can see the cerebrum. Here's the cerebellum right below it. So broken up into different lobes that correlate with kind of the bone that we just learned that would sit on top of it. So frontal is here, temporal, parietal, and then occipital in the back. So this just kind of breaks down the different areas that are responsible for different sensations or memories or whatever. You can see here is the primary taste area. Visual association occurs back here. Sensory speech is in this area. Auditory association would occur here. Kind of just the different areas of the brain. So next we'll look at the other component of the central nervous system, which is the spinal cord. So the outer portion is going to be composed of the white matter, as you can see here, and then the inner is composed of gray matter, and it kind of has that weird H shape, or it looks like a butterfly. Some people associate it with that. So this is gray matter inside, surrounded by white matter on the outside. So primary functions, this is the center for all spinal cord reflexes. The sensory tracts conduct impulses to the brain, while the motor tracts are going to conduct impulses away from the brain. So if there's an injury to the spinal cord in which the cord is cut all the way across, impulses can no longer travel to the brain to any part of the body below the injury. So that's where paralyzation comes in. So here you can see the nerves that correlate with the spinal cord and the vertebrae that they are by. So the covering of the spinal cord, well, of the central nervous system, I guess, are the bones of the cranium and then the vertebrae. So this provides our protection. And then we also have what's referred to as meninges. So cerebral and spinal meninges, composed of dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. So the meninges form a protective covering around the spinal cord. Within that, we'll have these fluid spaces. So we'll see them in the subarachnoid spaces of the meninges, the central canal of the spinal cord, and ventricles of the brain. So the CSF, or spinal fluid, is going to fill the fluid spaces, providing protection, nutrients, and waste removal. So here you can see, if we're looking at the spinal cord, here's that H area of gray matter, and then the white matter around it. The first covering is going to be the pia mater, and then we have the arachnoid covered up by the dura on the very outside. So now we'll get into the peripheral nervous system. So broken down into cranial nerves and spinal nerves. The cranial nerves, there's 12 pairs, which are attached to the undersurface of the brain, and they connect the brain with the neck and structures in the thorax and the abdomen. The spinal nerves are made up of 31 pairs. These are going to conduct the impulses necessary for sensations and voluntary movements. So here you can see the cranial nerves, and this just kind of shows you what they are responsible for. So the vestibular cochlear nerve is responsible for hearing, and that's cranial nerve number 8. And this chart is in your book that kind of details the different names of the nerve and then where the impulses are conducted and main functions. So a subdivision of the peripheral nervous system is going to be the autonomic nervous system. So this is made up of motor neurons that conduct impulses from the central nervous system to the cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glandular epithelial tissue. So those 3 tissues are all involuntary. This system is responsible for involuntary actions. The way that this system is set up is you will have a preganglionotic autonomic neuron, which conducts impulses from the spinal cord to the autonomic ganglion, which is a group of nerve cell bodies. And then the impulse is going to travel through the postganglionotic neurons to the cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glandular epithelial tissue. So we have the central nervous system here, going to go down a preganglionotic fiber to the ganglion, where we find that cell body, and then it's going to go through the postganglionotic fiber to the organ that it's innervating. So this just kind of gives you a breakdown of the sympathetic and parasympathetic pathways, which are all controlled by the autonomic nervous system. So the sympathetic division is going to be found in the thoracolumbar region, so in the chest and then the lumbar, so lower spine area. So we're looking at the thoracic cavity and the pelvic abdominal cavity. So the structure of this, the dendrites and cell bodies of the preganglionotic neurons are going to be found in the gray matter of the thoracic and upper lumbar segments of the spinal cord. The impulses are going to leave the spinal column and then synapse with several postganglionotic neurons. The main functions of this division are going to be our stress system. So sympathetic is responsible for our fight or flight response. So this is going to come into play when we feel strong emotions such as anger, fear, and anxiety, which we've all felt before. So that's, your heart is racing, you're kind of sweaty, you can feel the adrenaline pumping in your blood. That's part of the fight or flight response. At this point, when it comes into play, our body feels like we need some sort of physiological preparation because of a threat that we're experiencing. So the parasympathetic is going to be the craniosacral division. So the dendrites and cell bodies of the preganglionotic neurons are found in the gray matter of the brainstem and the sacral segments of the spinal cord. These impulses are going to leave the spinal column and then synapse with only one postganglionotic neuron. Main function is everyday conditions. Normal conditions is when the parasympathetic division really works. This is known as the rest and digest system. So heart rate lowers, bowels start to function again, kind of our everyday normal. When people say that they are stress eating, this is kind of the neurological response that causes people to stress eat. So when our sympathetic division is kind of taking over, all of the blood kind of goes away from those central organs in the abdomen to the muscles, which makes us feel like we're not hungry at all. So if you eat when you're in a stressful situation, some people say that it kind of tricks the mind into thinking that the parasympathetic division should take over. Because if we're eating kind of on a primal level, if you're eating, that means that you don't perceive any sort of threat. So, just kind of an interesting thing, I think. So the neurotransmitters of the autonomic nervous system are a little bit different. We have cholinergic and adrenergic. So the preganglionotic axons of the parasympathetic and sympathetic system and the postganglionotic axons of the parasympathetic are going to release acetylcholine, while the axons of the sympathetic postganglionotic neurons are going to release norepinephrine. So just keep in mind that all of the axons of the autonomic nervous system are going to release acetylcholine, except for the axon of the sympathetic postganglionotic neurons. Those release norepinephrine. So the autonomic nervous system as a whole is going to regulate the body's automatic functions. Most organs are dually innervated, which means that they receive impulses from the parasympathetic and sympathetic system. So like we were just talking about with the stomach, when the sympathetic system is in play, the bowels don't work, blood has rushed from the abdominal cavity to the muscles to prepare for the flight or fight response. But those organs are also innervated by the parasympathetic, which causes the bowels to start to work once we've calmed down and we're back to that normal resting state. That is the end of chapter 9. If you guys have any questions, feel free to contact me.